Want to take a GUI and change it so that every label is prefixed with a number that shows how deep that particular GUI is within a compound GUI. So the label hello here got a 1 because it's inside this vertical panel, while the OK button got a 2 because it's inside a horizontal panel, which is inside a vertical panel. To write show depth, we start as usual with our template for GUI functions. When we get to that step, but let's write some examples now. So test show depth on a label. If we have a label with nothing around it, then what we should get back is a 0 because it's nested inside 0 other container GUIs. Similarly, if we have a button by itself, a button that's enabled, labeled OK, and we show its depth, then we still have a button. It still says OK, but prefixed with a 0 and still enabled. If we have a choice, then I'm going to say that we don't want to change any of the choices because they're not labels in the sense that I want to show the depth. So I will just leave a choice alone. And then I have vertical panels, which can have a label inside and a button inside. Let's make that button disabled, just for variety. Now in this case, we have a vertical panel, so the label is nested 1 deep. And the button is also labeled 1 deep because it's inside that vertical panel. And then the same thing happens with a horizontal panel. Let's say we have a button here. It's enabled, and a choice with no choices. Well, with 1 choice because we have to select one of them. And in that case, I have horizontal button 1 cancel, and still the same choice. And then we can make our big example by taking the GUI, and it turns out that all of the labels on controls here get prefixed with a true. So on a label and on a button they get 2 because each of them are inside a vertical and a horizontal. So those are our examples. I've already written down the template because after you've done a template once for GUIs, it turns out to always be the same. And we can start implementing it. So if we've got a label, then we have an example here that says label, and we're supposed to prefix a 0 in. We can write this, and it matches our example, but it looks a little suspicious. Because that shouldn't be what always happens to a label. You can see down here in this case, there's a label that gets a prefix 1, so how will we ever get a 1 on there? And we can look at the vertical case here to see what we would be doing. We would recur or show depth on that label, and it would just put a 0 on. So what's happening here is that the template is not quite giving us the right thing. We can do something with an immediate label or immediate button where we prefix a number on the front. But when we have a horizontal panel or vertical panel and we make recursive calls, then that prefixes a 0 on each, which doesn't help us so much in putting a 1 on front of each of these things. And the problem is, it's when we get down to a button, we need to know how far we got, how many vertical and horizontal panels we went through to get to this button. In other words, we need to accumulate some information. So we have to add an extra argument, and this argument is different than an argument that's along for the ride. It's an accumulator that accumulates information about how we got there. So this accumulator is going to let us keep track of how far we go, because we will increment it every time we recur through a vertical. And there's another detail here, which is this function with an accumulator I'm calling show depth at. the function that we originally wanted is show depth. So we know we can implement a show depth if we have a show depth at that starts off with 0. So that's what we're going to do. We end up writing show depth at instead. So I'm writing show depth at first and adding an accumulator. And again, the reason I figured out I needed an accumulator was because I needed to push information down this tree effectively. I needed to know how did I get here, which was different from many of our other problems where we could always just compute the result, and that result was useful for an enclosing context. So show depth is going to use show depth at on G and 0. And notice that one of the things we could do now is test show depth at instead of show depth. So this would be a good thing to do, is to convert all of our test case really to show depth at. And I can put a 3 here. And then we really only need a test or 2 for show depth, but I will leave all my tests as they are for the moment. So in show depth at, instead of always string appending 0, we always put a space there, but the number is not 0, it's the number to string of n, or actually it's called toString, I believe. ToString of n onto a space, onto the label t. And the same thing happens with button. So I could copy and paste this, but maybe what I really want is a helper function. Let's call it prefix, which takes a number and a string and prefixes a string onto the number. Okay, in principle, rewrite test for prefix. Okay. So prefix in on that label as well, keeping the enabled state. All right, and let's write just a test here. Prefix 7 onto x should give us 7 space x. Choices, we said we're going to leave choices alone, so we can do that. And now when we recur, we don't recur at show depth, we recur at show depth at. And the template would suggest we just pass along the n, but we do that when n is just along for the ride. In this case, n is accumulating information, and this is a point. Whenever you have a recursive call, you have to think, what information am I accumulating here? And what I'm accumulating here is the idea that I've gone down by 1. I've gone inside a vertical panel. So n goes up by 1. And then I put those together. And then the same for horizontal. Okay. So with all of those in place, like I said, it's really better to convert the test to the interesting function, so I'll do that. Change these all to ats. And I will pass in various numbers here. Doesn't matter what number I pass in here because it's not used. This one I'll leave the tests alone. This one I'll just pick 6, which will make these, this is 7 here. Okay. So with that, I've got a bunch of examples. Notice that if it wasn't clear what my accumulator was doing here in this particular show depth that function, then my examples would have helped me figure out what the accumulator is supposed to do. Horizontal. Okay, and I got a type error because I forgot to make these show depth that, and I forgot the n+1 there. Okay, And looking through, all of our tests passed.